Today I want to point out to you I'm trying some new things. Uh, I think you guys remember that the microphone was crackly, so I've got a new microphone. It looks like a small woodland creature. And unfortunately, my little iPhone mini died. So yeah, so here we go. So I've got a new phone, so who knows how this video is going to turn out? We'll see. Now, would you like to know the secret to retiring early? Yes. You will get bored. You will get bored. So think about this. You spend your, so by the way, retirement, is that a new idea or an old idea? It's a new idea. Used to be people basically worked until they died. So we always had this kind of balance between work, let's call it mental stimulation, and leisure. Why does leisure have value to you now? Because it's scarce. But what if we had all sorts of leisure, like retirement? Then suddenly leisure is no longer scarce. Is it as valuable? No. In fact, leisure really only has value when it's also in the presence of work, right? Friday wouldn't mean, and I've been this way in the summertime because of my job, and I'm like, Friday doesn't feel any different to me than a Tuesday. And it's because leisure in the absence of work is not as valuable, you just lose track of time. So keep yourself mentally stimulated, find new things, but don't let yourself get bored because that's when you start. In fact, I was just reading an article on this morning. How do you keep your mind sharp in old age? You got to keep learning new things, right? So learn how to watercolor, whatever it is that trips your trigger. Okay, now last time we had talked about interest rate risk or price risk. And can you tell me what the two things are that make interest rate risk or price risk greater? Say again? So time to maturity, right? So the amount of time, that's one. What's the other one? I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the coupons. Okay, let's keep going here. Something to do with coupons. Interest rate risk. If the coupons are, let's assume the coupons are zero. Where is all the value of the bond coming from? Whoop, that thing at the very end. That's going to be terribly, terribly risky, right? Because it's all coming from that to the 30th power kind of thing hanging out on the end. Whereas as the coupons get bigger and bigger and bigger, then more of the value of the bond is being received sooner in time, and so that interest rate risk goes down. Now, why do I review these things with you? Because there's this other kind of risk called reinvestment risk. And that is the risk that you will not be able to reinvest the money that you get from the bond at the same or higher rate. It's the risk that you will not be able to reinvest at the same or higher rate. And so, yeah, we've been getting these nice juicy 10% coupons, and then the bond matures, and suddenly I've got money I've got to try to reinvest. Or I've got big coupons all along. Every 6 months I get a huge coupon that I've got to figure out what to do with, right? And so the reinvestment risk is greater with shorter time to maturity and larger coupons. So it's exactly the opposite of interest rate risk. The reinvestment risk is greater with shorter time to maturity and larger coupons. So what does this mean? If you say, well, wait a minute, I want to get away from reinvestment risk totally, what kind of risk have you taken on? Interest rate risk. And if you say, I want to get rid of interest rate risk totally, what kind of risk have you taken on? Reinvestment risk. You can't get away from it. Questions? Okay, now we're on to bond features.
Get away from reinvestment risk.
I suppose it would depend on you. Assume that you weren't planning to reinvest that money. Assume that you were planning to live off those coupons. Then I would try to get rid of the interest rate risk instead of the reinvestment risk. Does that make sense? Of course, you're still going to have that face value at the end that we hope you're going to reinvest. By the way, are there easy answers? No, everything is what the hell? Everything is an optimization, right? We're always trading off. So let's talk about bond features. First of all, I want you to know that debt is not an ownership claim. So undoubtedly, you have ran into people or overheard these conversations where one person says to the other, "Wow, that's a nice Harley Davidson, man." And the other guy says, "Yeah, the bank owns it." Now, what does he mean? He means he probably owes more money on it than it's worth, but does the bank truly own it? No. When's the only time that the bank is going to take ownership of it? Yeah, if he defaults, then they're going to send some person out there to scoop it up in the middle of the night. If they're in Texas, they'll be wearing a flak jacket because that's how they roll. So ownership only passes to the debt holder if the borrower defaults. Now, why is that important? Who makes the decisions about stuff? The owner does. And so even though I owe money on my house, I still get to decide what color to paint the walls and things like that. By the way, gentlemen, always let her pick what color to paint the walls. She cares, you don't, right? This is one of my secrets to a happy marriage. You should see my house. Okay. Okay. Now, the next thing to know is the company's payment of interest is considered a cost of doing business. And because it is a cost of doing business, it's tax deductible. In other words, we subtract it out before calculating our pre-tax income. And so there's this tax benefit of debt. You don't get that from dividends. Dividends, if you remember the way the income statement's set up, dividends show up down here below net income when the taxes are already paid. Unpaid debt is a liability of the firm. Now let's talk about this word liability. It is a legal obligation to pay. Liability is a legal obligation. Oh, he's late with those legs. I only got one laugh out of that. You guys are so worried about offending people. You got to stop. Okay, back to the story. Dividends are not tax deductible. Did I already say that? Yeah. Oh, unpaid debt is a liability of the firm. What is a liability? It's a legal obligation to pay. It means if you don't pay, they can do what? Okay, so they have the legal right to push you into, starts with a B, bankruptcy, so they can get their, as much money as they can out of you. If you fail to pay, it gives the lenders the right to take control of the assets. It's easy to see how that happens with a car or a motorcycle. How does it happen with a house? Yeah, but what do they do first? So they go through this thing called foreclosure, which is where they go to the court, they present the evidence that you haven't been paying your mortgage, then you get a notice, and they tell you to be out in 30 days. And if you're not out in 30 days, the sheriff's deputies show up and they toss all your crap in the front yard. And it's up to you to get the yard cleaned up, right? To get your stuff out of there. By the way, do you think a lot of people wait and go ahead and, yeah, a lot of people's stuff ends up in the yard because they're just suspension of disbelief. They think it's not going to happen. Okay, here we go. What else we got? Short-term debt. Remember, in accounting and finance, everything short-term is, less than a year. Anything long-term is greater than a year. And we specifically have two kinds of long-term debt up here. We have notes, which are between 1 and 10 years original issue maturity, meaning the time to maturity on the day they were born. The time to maturity on the day they were born, that's initial issue or original issue maturity. And then bonds would be greater than 10 years of original issue maturity. Now, why do we have to say original issue maturity instead of just maturity? Because otherwise, here's what people will do. They say, well, I have a bond with 11 years left to pay on it. After next year, it'll become a note. No, it doesn't work that way. It has to do with what you were when you were born. If you were born a bond, you'll die a bond. If you're born a note, you're going to die a note. This stuff doesn't change just because time has passed. Questions? So let's talk about the bond indenture. Indenture, some of you are undoubtedly thinking about false teeth, but an indenture is a contract or an agreement. And so basically the bond indenture is this agreement between the borrower and the lender. Now, when you guys go to borrow money to buy a house or a car, who writes the contract, the borrower or the lender? The lender, right? The lender writes it, and what are your choices? You either accept it or you don't, right? Those are your choices. Now, here's the funky thing about bonds. It's the borrower that writes the agreement. It's the borrower that writes the agreement. And you say, wait, how can that be? It has to do with the nature of the lenders. With bonds, there is one borrower and many, many lenders. If I tried to get you guys together to agree on a common set of things that you wanted to see in the bond indenture, I can almost guarantee that you would not reach an agreement. Instead, what I'm going to do as the borrower is I'm going to put together a package of things in this agreement that I think will make it attractive enough that enough of you will decide to buy my bonds. And so it's the borrower that writes the bond indenture, the borrower. So what kinds of things are in the bond indenture? So we're going to talk about all of these individually, but they're going to have terms and security, seniority, repayment, and potentially a call provision. By the way, repayment and call provision, not always in there, and we'll get to that. So what are the terms? Well, first of all, there's the face value. Now, unless I tell you otherwise, what's the face value of a bond? $1,000. Now, do you think the lawyers are going to let us get by with not saying what the face value is because we all assume it's 1,000? No, it's going to say, right? It's going to be written right there. And it also has the coupon rate. And not only does it have the coupon rate, it says whether those coupons are semi-annual or annual coupons. It'll have the maturity date. That's the date that big $1,000 face value is going to be paid. And then finally, it has the bond form. Let's talk about this idea of bond forms. Back in the day, all bonds were bearer bonds. A bearer is the holder, like the ring bearer in a wedding ceremony is the person who's holding the rings. If you have a bearer bond, who do you think is able to collect the interest on the bond? Yeah, whoever's got their hands on it. This sounds a little dangerous. Have you guys ever seen Die Hard? What are they going after in the safe at the Nakatomi building? Bearer bonds. And why? Because whoever's got their hands on them collects the cash. So bearer bonds are dangerous because if they get stolen, you're just out of luck. And it's worse than that. Let's assume that you are an eccentric person and you've decided you're going to keep your bearer bonds between your mattress and your box springs at home. And you come home after a hard night of partying and you decide to lay in your bed and smoke a Marlboro Light while you go off to sleep. Unfortunately, you fall asleep sooner than you think and your cigarette catches your mattress on fire. You leap from the bed just in time to escape the flames and you go, whew, that was good that I missed. And then you realize, oh no, my bearer bonds were underneath that mattress. The next morning, you call General Electric. They're the people who issued the bearer bonds. and you say, hey, last night my mattress burnt and I lost 5 of these bearer bonds. Could you send me out some replacements? What's General Electric going to say? Why? They're not obligated to. And further, if this game actually works, what am I going to do every day of the world? I'm going to call them up. I'm like, God, happened again. I know I need to stop smoking. Those bearer bonds just went up in flames again. Can you send me some more? Does this make sense?
So you have a bond, this now, you're still sending them, or do they have a registration? Or they know they need to pay you?
Okay, we're going to get to that. And the word registration was the key there. That's where we get to registered bonds. But back in the day, people didn't have that, so we had bearer bonds. Now, most 95% plus of bonds today are electronic registered bonds, meaning they don't even exist in a paper sense. They're purely electronic. And what do those people have they have to know your home address because they're going to mail you a check, or they have to know your checking account number because they're going to do an ACH, advanced clearing, or whatever it is, ACH to put money into your account. They have to have your birthday, and they have to have your social security number. Why do they have to have your social security number? To prove you're you. I like that. What else? Who are they going to report your bond income to? The government. Why? Because interest is taxed. Does that make sense? Now, knowing what you've just figured out about registered bonds, what might bearer bonds be good for? Yeah, cheating on your taxes. So they're very popular in Europe. Why? Tax rates in Europe are high, right? And so the higher the tax rates are, the more of the population will be interested in cheating on their taxes. And in fact, it's so widely known. This is kind of fun. So think about a paycheck. When you get a paycheck, there's that big number up at the top, and then there's the little number at the bottom, which is what you actually get to spend. To you, which of those numbers is more meaningful? Yeah, the little one, right? That's what you get to spend. When is the only time that you mention the big one? When you're trying to impress your friends at the class reunion. That's it, right? Now, the rest of the time, you're thinking about, oh crap, I only have $17 left till the end of the month, and I'm going to get this amount, this little amount, and then I'll be okay. We care about after-tax return. We care only about after-tax return. Now, if I'm cheating on my taxes, what's the relationship between my before tax return and my after tax return? They're the same. Thank you. They are the same. And so what does this mean? It means that these Europeans will demand a lower yield on a bond than an American because they're able to use these European issued bearer bonds to cheat on their taxes. And here's the next fun thing. Let's see, where was I going with that? Oh, the biggest issuers of these European bearer bonds, you think they're probably European companies like BMW and Mercedes? No. Who are they? They're American companies, right? Are American companies willing to take advantage of other people's scofflaw nature? Yeah, it's not my responsibility to make sure you follow the law. And if they catch you, I'm going to clap as they take you away in handcuffs. But until then, I'll be glad to accept your money. Does that make sense? So, how do you collect these things? Well, they're bearer bonds. What you do, and by the way, these European bonds, they pay coupons annually. You say, why not semi-annually? Well, because you've got to trot your ass down to Geneva and turn in your coupons to get your money. So here you are, you've taken the family to San Moritz for, your winter skiing vacation. And you go into Credit Suisse and you turn in your coupons and they give you the money in cash and you stuff it into your ski jacket. And then you walk out and you look like you're 40 pounds heavier than when you walked in. But you know what? Tax-free income, baby. Okay, any questions on that? By the way, does this mean you should sit outside of Credit Suisse and watch for skinny people walking in who have walked out larger and then roll them and take? No, that's immoral. Even though they're breaking the law, it doesn't give you the right to roll them in the parking lot. Any other question? Oh, by the way, something else you could use bearer bonds for. How about laundering money? If I find you with, so I've got some dirty money, I buy some bearer bonds from you, and then if I want to get that money across the border into Mexico, it's just one little suitcase or one little briefcase with a bunch of bearer bonds in it. The equivalent amount of cash would probably take up an entire pallet, right? The bales of cash. So, whew, walking across the border, the guy says, "Senor, what's in your briefcase?" I say, "It's my collection of antique paperwork," or some, I just make up a story. He's like, "Whoa, those are pretty," because usually bonds are quite pretty if you get a look at them. But in the meantime, do you think he has any idea what I'm doing? Probably not. And by the way, if he did, what could I do? Yeah. Hey, would you like one of these for yourself? I knew a guy who knows a guy who sold marijuana in California before it was legal. And his goal was to raise $325,000. Don't know how he came up with the money, with the number, but he did. And then as soon as he got that, he was going to retire to Mexico. And so he actually stored the money in coolers in his backyard. He dug holes and, because you can't take it to the bank, right? They're like, "Hey, bro, where did you get $325,000? And by the way, why is it all in these crumpled up?" Yeah. Okay, so he manages to get the money, and then he bought some bearer bonds with the money. He goes down to Mexico, does this little shuffle we just discussed, and when he gets there, he cashes out about $100,000 worth of the bonds and uses that to buy citizenship in Mexico. Did you know that you're not really allowed to become a Mexican citizen with $100,000? It seems to work. So you can use it for cheating on your taxes. You can use it for laundering money. Am I telling you to do either one of these things? No. You don't want to go to jail. So let's talk about security. Security is what the lender is going to be able to take if you don't pay. And we talk about this word collateral a lot with consumer lending. For instance, we say that the collateral for an auto loan is, what's the collateral for a car loan? The car, right? And what's the collateral for your mortgage? The house, right? Now, with bonds, though, there's a specific meaning. The specific meaning of collateral with bonds is a basket of securities that may be taken by the lender in the event of a default. It's a basket of securities that may be taken by the lender in the event of a default. Now, what kinds of securities? Well, it's got to be stuff that's less risky than the company, right? So if you've got bonds from the United States government and you're not wanting to sell them, but you could use them as collateral to secure a bond issue. So that would be one idea. Would you ever use a firm's stock as collateral for its bonds? No, why not, Mr. Litterman? Yeah, so if the bonds are kaput, guess what that means about the stock? Remember, the stockholders are in the back of the line. The bondholders are in front of them. Don't ever accept a company's stock as collateral. I can think of one exception to that. Do you guys remember Toys R Us? Yeah, Toys R Us had basically two divisions. They had the US division and they had the Canadian division. And the US division was hurting and the Canadian division was profitable. And so they were actually able to use the stock of the Canadian firm as collateral for the bonds of the US firm. Simply because the US firm was riskier than the bonds of the US firm were riskier than the stock of the Canadian firm. It's complex, and I don't expect you to remember that. But every once in a while, we see weird stuff in finance. And if you read the Wall Street Journal long enough, you pick up on these weird things. Now let's talk about mortgage securities. Mortgage securities, you can probably guess by the name, my house loan is called a mortgage. It's because it's backed by property. And so any sort of bond that's backed by property is a mortgage security. Then we have what are called debentures. A debenture in the US is unsecured, meaning that if they don't pay, you basically just have to get in line and hope for your share of the leftovers at liquidation. In the UK, if any of you wind up working in the UK, debentures there are secured. How did we come to this situation, even though we both technically speak English? No idea. No idea. But for our purposes in this class, you can assume a debenture is unsecured. And we have a special case of a note. We talked about a note earlier in terms of being 1 to 10 years. There's something else that you need to know about notes, and that is that they are unsecured. Unsecured. Have you guys ever heard of a signature loan at the bank? It's only backed by your signature. So my cousin owned a trucking business, and he could just walk into the bank and say, I need $100,000. And they would type up the paperwork, he would sign, and they would give him the money. There was nothing in the loan paperwork that said they could take anything if he didn't pay. So there was no collateral. It was unsecured. It's a signature loan, backed only by a signature. Notes are a similar idea. They're backed by nothing but the full credit and faith of whoever's borrowing it. By the way, United States government debt, secured or unsecured? Let's think about this. If it's secured and the US government defaults, what do I get to take? California, right? By the way, I'm willing to let our Asian friends have California, So, by the way, did you know that one of our biggest lenders is Japan? Another one of our biggest lenders is China, right? I think they might like California, so let's let them have that, right? Okay, so it is unsecured. And in fact, I mentioned backed by the full faith and credit. That's what we talk about the United States dollar and the United States Treasury. It's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It's actually unsecured. Questions? Yeah. Well, so a security is what you get to take in case of default. We're not talking about whether or not they're going to default. And by the way, are they truly default risk free? No. Questions? Now let's talk about seniority. Have any of you ever had a job where seniority mattered? What did you do, Jace? As a what? Okay. And seniority has everything to do with how long you've been there. And so people who have been there longer have greater seniority. And what do they get for that? Higher pay? Yeah, so the longer you're there, the more seniority. So when I worked in the grocery store, by the way, I used to be a union member. I know, it's scandalous. So I was a union member, and we would get breaks. We get 15 minutes every 4 hours. And you got to go to break in order of seniority. So the highest seniority person there got first choice of when to go to break. And then no one else could go to break until after they'd gone to break. And of course, if they were a real toad, they would wait until way too late, and then no one could take the break, which you wanted to meet them in the parking lot afterward. But we have something similar with seniority among bonds, and it has to do with who gets paid first. The more senior the bond, the closer they are to the pot of money when everything goes sideways. And so we talk about senior debt. Senior debt is senior to junior debt. And junior debt is senior to subordinated debt. Remember the other day we were talking about General Motors and Chrysler, and we had the senior debt holders that were holding those 100-year GM bonds, and then we had the auto union holding the subordinated debt. In theory, those senior bondholders should have been paid first, then the junior bondholders, and then the subordinated bondholders. But because of a quirk of politics, they changed that order around and put the subordinated debt holders first. That doesn't happen very often, but it is apparently now possible. Okay, subordinate. By the way, remember that the further up on this list you are, so which one of these is the safest? Yeah, the senior debt's going to be the safest. Now, which one of these is the riskiest? Subordinated debt. Which one of these is going to have the highest yield to maturity? It's got to be the subordinated because it's the riskiest. Which one's going to have the lowest yield to maturity? It's got to be the senior debt because it's got the least risk. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so in the beginning, so the company, let's say this has been a while back, they issue their very first debt issue. And at the time, that's the only one. They don't talk about it being senior or junior. But then they issue another issue and they say this one is junior to that one. But what you start to see over time is that they just go out and issue, oh, well, this one's a senior, this one's subordinated, and it starts to kind of lose its meaning, except for where it is in the pecking order of repayment, which dictates also the yield and maturity. Yeah. Yep. By the way, everything that I do, as far as picking things that I'm going to include in the indenture, it all has to do with trying to reduce my cost of borrowing. Trying to reduce my cost of borrowing. And I'm trying to do it in such a way that I'm not limiting what I plan to do anyway. So when we get to something called, we'll get to these things called covenants, and we'll talk about how those impact. Now let's talk about repayment. If there are no repayment arrangements, there is absolutely no principal paid back until the bond matures. Remember that bonds are making these coupon payments, which are interest, these little coupon payments all the way along, and then they get to the end of the life, and then whoop, they pay off the whole thing. Now, at that point, do you think the company is paying off this whole thing from cash they've got sitting around? No. So what do? They issue new bonds to pay off the old bonds. Does that make sense? Okay. As long as they're able to do that, everything's perfectly fine. However, what if they're not? Then we have this probability of default. So what would I rather as a bondholder happen? Well, I would rather that they set aside some money every year and actually buy back some of those bonds. We're trying to pay down the principal on this so it's not all due at the end. I can't pay down the principal by saying, okay, you guys, I'm going to give you all $100 and now your bond face value is only $900. It doesn't work that way. So how do I do it? Well, I repurchase the bonds that I've issued. And so I go out there and hopefully they're being traded in the open market, because then I can just take the money and go buy the bonds and we're done with it and everybody's happy. But what if these bonds are not traded on the public market? Then I have to use something called a call provision. And we're going to talk about that here momentarily. And that allows me to force you to sell your bond back to me. But either way, what I'm doing is buying down a portion of those bonds every year so that when I get to the end, I'm not owing this huge chunk of money. I'm owing a relatively small chunk of money. I'll give you an example of this danger. So you remember my cousin Harry that was in jail down in Mexico? Okay, so after Harry gets back from Mexico, he buys a house in Kansas City, and I go to see Harry, and I'm like, wow, Harry, this is a nice house. He's like, thanks. I said, how do you afford this? He says, oh, I've got this really great mortgage. I said, tell me about your mortgage. Keep in mind, I'm 12. I said, tell me about your mortgage. He says, well, every month I really only pay interest. And then at year 15, I have to pay everything. It's called a balloon mortgage. I'm like, well, balloons are fun, but that sounds dangerous, right? I said, Harry, what are you going to do when you get to year 15? I said, you're not going to have that kind of money. And he says, I'll figure it out then. By the way, do you think Harry still has the house? No. So what's the intention? Hopefully your credit rating will be better, you'll be in a better place, so you'll be able to refinance that balloon. But it was riskier because he basically wasn't paying anything down on the house as he went. And that's exactly what it is when we've got a bond issue and we don't pay it down as we go. Okay, now, where do we get this money? Well, the company puts the money into something called the sinking fund. Whenever we issue bonds, we call it a flotation. What's the opposite of flotation? Sinking. And so this fund is money we're going to use to sink the bond issue. Who holds on to this money? Someone called a bond trustee. The bond trustee is a third party, not the borrower, not the lender, a third party, of course, selected by the borrower. But the borrower pays the money to them, and then they go out into the market and use it to repurchase these bonds. So that's how that happens. Sinking funds reduce the risk of a bond issue. We've already discussed why that is, because it's not this big old hunk of money out there at the end they have to pay. As a result, if I include a sinking fund provision in my indenture, what do you think my yield to maturity is going to look like? Got to be lower because I'm taking risk off of the bondholders. Remember, if I take risk off of people, they don't demand as much return. And so the yield will be lower on a bond with a sinking fund, ceteris paribus, meaning all else equal. Questions? Now let's talk about the call provision. The call provision is an option. An option is the right but not the obligation to do something. So this call provision gives the bond issuer the right but not the obligation to repurchase a bond at a set amount above the face value. That set amount above the face value is usually 1 year worth of coupons, and it's called the call premium. So let's say I've got a bond with 8% coupons. That means that it's $80 a year worth of coupons. And so I might say that the call premium would be $80. So I will pay you $1,080 to get that bond back. So if I have a sinking fund, then I will be using this call provision to repurchase those bonds. But what if I'm not even needing to do it for those purposes? What's another reason that I might be willing to pay you $1,080 for your bond? I'll give you a hint. What happens to bond prices as yields fall? Yeah, it goes up. Now, so right now in the beginning, I'm telling you this bond, it's the yield is equal to the coupon rate. So what's the bond sell for? If the yield is equal to the coupon rate, the bond sells for par. Very good. It's par bond. So it's for $1,000. But take a look at what happens as the yield goes down. That bond value starts to go up. Now, here's the fun part. At some point, that bond value may go over 1,080. At that point, it's worth it to me to use that call provision to buy a bond that may be worth 1,095 to buy it for 1,080. And where do I get the money? Well, I go out and I issue new bonds at a lower interest rate because, after all, yields have fallen. And so this is my opportunity to get rid of these high coupon bonds. As a bond holder, do you like the idea that they could do this to you? No. So this raises the risk for the bondholder. As a result, what does that do to the required yield to maturity? Yeah, it goes up. So I have a true story. This is from the Wall Street Journal way back when. And there were these little old ladies down in Florida. This is before 2001 when we had the terrorist attacks. Little old ladies down in Florida, and their husbands had bought these 20 to 30-year bonds back when inflation was high. When inflation's high, interest rates are high, yield to maturities are high, and so people issue bonds with large coupons because they want those bonds to sell for face value. And so these little old ladies are cashing in, let's say they're 12% coupons, and they're living off those coupons down in Florida. And when the bonds mature, they go down to, and this is post September 11th, they go down to their broker to take the new money and reinvest it. And the broker says, hey, wait a minute, I've got, yeah, I could give you bonds of similar risk. They have coupon of 6%. So the little old ladies have been consuming or getting 12% coupons, and now he's offering them 6. Are they happy? They're like, what's up? And so then he has to give them a little lesson in economics and the Federal Reserve and the whole thing. In the end, he says, you're not going to do better than this. And they're like, well, certainly there's got to be something that's better than this. He says, well, he says, I do have this bond from the same borrower, but it pays 0.25% more per year in coupon. They say, well, 0.25%, that's better than nothing. And so they jump in and they buy these bonds. And then interest rates go down even further, and these little old ladies start getting letters in the mail with checks. And they wonder why they're getting checks. And so they all pile in the Buick, because it's a Buick, and they drive down to the broker's office. Could be a Lexus. They drive down to the broker's office and they ask what's going on. And he said, well, you remember that extra 0.25%? They said, yes. He said, well, the bonds that you bought had a call provision, and that extra 0.25% was compensation for the risk of exactly what just happened to you. And then, of course, they're mad, and he said, did you read the bond prospectus? And what do they say? No. Do most people read a bond prospectus? No. So the little old ladies, they go home in defeat and shame. And one of them said at the end of the article, things have gotten so bad, I can only eat at the country club twice per week. Isn't that heartbreaking? Okay, so there's my story for you to help you know the dangers of the call provision. As a result, you're going to require a higher yield to maturity. Questions? Now let's talk about protective covenants. Protective, by the way, my neighborhood has these things called covenants. I'm not allowed to have more than 3 dogs. I'm not allowed to have distasteful art in my front yard. Now, taste is a matter of taste, right? I think that my yellow Labrador Retriever cement dog is art, right? My neighbors, not so much. So we've got these covenants, and we've all agreed to live according to these things. The covenants are in the bond indenture, and they are basically the promises being made by the borrower to the lenders. And there are 2 kinds of them. There are negative covenants where we promise not to do naughty things, and there are positive covenants where we promise to do nice things. Let's talk about some negative covenants. Firms must limit dividend. By the way, let's get one thing straight here. Covenants are like a cafeteria or a buffet, right? Do you have to eat everything? No. So when you're putting together your bond indenture, you're going to select covenants where you promise to do things that you plan to do anyway, and you promise not to do things that you planned not to do anyway. And the reason you're making those promises is to make the bondholders feel more at ease. As a result, they require a lower yield to maturity, which lowers your borrowing cost. That's the whole game here. Okay, so the first one is firms must limit dividend payments. Why would you as a bondholder want me to limit my dividend payments? Say again? Okay, more capital in the company. Let's talk about what a dirty scumbag manager could do. By the way, I'm a dirty scumbag manager. Who am I supposed? What's the goal of my job? Maximize shareholder wealth. Did you hear anything in there about the bondholders? No. So here's what I could do. I could say to you guys, oh, hey, we've got this really safe project. We're going to, build a dairy to provide milk to school children. I mean, it sounds nice, right? You guys like, oh, yeah, I'll do that. So you buy these bonds for 6%. As soon as I get the money, I turn around and I pay out a huge dividend to my shareholders, and then I declare bankruptcy. Have I maximized shareholder wealth? Oh, yeah. I took your money and gave it to the shareholders, right? You're a bondholder. You bought my bond. I take that money, I give it to the shareholders, and I was like, boop, sorry, you're out of luck, pal. You see that? Okay, so that's the big thing we're trying to prevent. We also want to limit these dividends because we don't want them paying out so much in dividends that they can't afford to pay our coupons. So that's the more common reason. We want them to have enough money left to pay our coupons. So dividends are often limited to a percentage of the earnings. And so we say, well, you can only pay out 20% of your earnings, or you can only pay out 40% of your earnings as dividends. Now, of course, it's the borrower writing this, so the borrower gets to make that choice. What does the potential bondholder get to do? They get to look at it and decide whether or not that's good for them. Firm cannot pledge assets to other lenders. Let's talk about this. I have a house, and I was looking the other day. It was amazing what Zillow thinks my house is worth. I'm like, no, there's no way. But let's go with Zillow's number and say 600,000, which is total crap. 600,000. So I've got this $600,000 house. I owe $160,000 on it. How much equity do I have in the house? 600 minus 160 is 440, right? So I've got 440,000 in equity in this house. So I come to you and I say, I've got $440,000 in equity on this house. Would you loan me $250,000 with the house as collateral?
Sure.
Very good. Now, you didn't hear me just ask him that. I asked you the same thing. And you say, sure. And then I come to Samuel and I say, look, 400, $250,000? Yeah. Okay. So 250, 250, 250. Now I've got 750 million. How many payments do you think I'm going to make on these loans? 0. Man, I'm going to Mexico, right? Okay, so here's the problem. After you guys figure out that I'm not making the payments, what do? Samuel, what are you going to do? Samuel's going to show up on my porch. He's here to claim his house. And then who follows him? Coming, she's right behind him. And then who's behind her? Okay, so she gets up there and she's like, who the hell are you? He says, oh, I'm here to get my house. She's like, wait a minute, I'm here to get my house. And they're just about to get into a fight when he walks up. And now you've got a three-way fight on the porch of my house. This is what a three-way fight looks like, right? Okay, now, do you want that happening at bankruptcy? No, it's not good for anybody except for the lawyers, right? And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to pledge not to, we're going to say we won't pledge assets to other lenders. We can't merge with another firm. Now, once again, I want you to keep in mind this is the cafeteria approach. A lot of companies will not be able to put this in their bond indentures. For example, Netflix, Paramount, Warner, are those the three? Yeah, they're all playing this game. They can't make this promise. But why might the promise be reassuring to your bond investors? Pardon me. Let's assume that I have a business and my business is very safe. Once again, I've got a dairy providing milk to school children on a fixed price contract or fixed profit contract. So I'm guaranteed a profit to the Springfield School District, and you guys have loaned me money at 6% to to build this dairy. Now, my brother-in-law runs a nuclear waste cleanup operation. Do you think that might be riskier? Yeah. So these bondholders over here have loaned my brother-in-law 12%, money at 12% because his stuff's riskier. Now, my brother-in-law and I get together at Thanksgiving, and we're talking about our businesses, and we decide that there might be good reasons to merge our two firms. I cannot think of what they would be, but managers often come up with really lame reasons to buy companies. Example, eBay bought Skype, right? What, so you could talk to Cat Lady 63 from Hoboken? I don't want to talk to these people. I'd go to a rummage sale if I wanted to talk to these people, right? Okay, so they'll make up these stupid stories. But I've made up my own stupid story here. We're going to get our companies together. After we put these two companies together, now the debt requires 9% on average, right? So 6%, 12%, what's halfway in between those? I think it's 9. Okay, now you guys were getting 12% coupons and a 12% yield to maturity. Your bonds were worth $1,000. But now the yield to maturity has dropped to 9%. What just happened to the value of your bonds? Whoop! You guys are having a party, right? You're thrilled. In the meantime, you guys have 6% coupon bonds, which were yielding 6%, $1,000 value. Now they are at 9% yield to maturity. What kind of bonds do you hold now? Are they premium or discount? Oh, these people have the premium bonds. You guys have the discount bonds. And it turns out that any money that they gain is purely a wealth transfer from you. And so if you are a relatively safe company and you don't have plans to merge, you might want to make this pledge simply because it will help the bondholders sleep easier and they'll require a lower yield to maturity to fund your debt. Firm cannot sell or lease major assets without lender approval if the assets of the firm, so let's assume that it's an unsecured loan. It's backed by the general assets of the firm. What could the firm do immediately? Let's say they have $1 billion in assets. You say, sure, I'll loan you $100 million. And then immediately after you loan them that $100 million, then they turn around and pay out $100 million, and they also sell $100 million worth of assets and pay that money out too. Now, when the bankruptcy happens, there is less assets to pay you. The lower their assets, the less likely you are to get paid. And so that's why we're saying don't sell or lease additional assets, because they could pay that money out to the shareholder and leave you hanging. Firms cannot issue additional long-term debt. This one is also uncommon. This is also uncommon. Why? Most companies issue long-term debt frequently. Most companies issue long-term debt frequently. You remember what I told you, how they're going to pay off the old debt? They're going to issue new debt. And so you won't see this one very often. But why would it be, he's looking kind of sad, why would you as a bondholder hope that I wouldn't borrow money from anybody else? Think back to our chapter 3 discussion. Who would you rather loan money to? Someone that has a lot of debt or someone that has very little debt? Yeah, a little. So if I loan money to you and you've got very little debt, I might give you a favorable interest rate. But then you turn around and borrow additional money from a lot of different people. You're not as secure as you were when I loaned you that money. So if you'll promise not to borrow any more money, then I am more willing to give you that lower interest rate. If you say, no, I'm going to go out and borrow a bunch more money, then I'm going to charge you a higher rate. You're going to demand a higher yield to maturity. Questions? Now, positive covenants. The firm must maintain, what is NWC? Very good. Net working capital. Firm must maintain net working capital at or above a stated minimum level. Why would I care? By the way, net working capital is about the short-term cash flows of the firm. Why would I care if I were a bondholder? Yeah. If you don't meet your short-term obligations, there is no long-term, right? By the way, did you know suppliers can force you into bankruptcy just the same as bondholders? Yeah. And so they may be paying their coupons in a timely manner, but if they're not paying their suppliers, you're going to end up in bankruptcy court just the same. And so you want to make sure that they keep enough money in there to pay their suppliers and all of their short-term debts. The firm must periodically furnish audited financial statements to the bondholders. So let's start out with financial statements. Why would the bondholders be interested in seeing financial statements? Yeah, so they can see the financial health of the company. In fact, how am I going to guarantee that you're not lying about the net working capital unless I can see your financial statements? So that's how the company's going to prove that they're doing that. The second thing that I want to point out here is the fact that they are audited financial statements. What does audited mean? Yeah, someone else is taking a look. Now, are they guaranteeing that they're correct? No, it's a random sampling. And so what they're doing is they're taking a random sample of transactions, and they're also, of course, looking for funky stuff. But the audited financial statement should be more reliable than an unaudited financial statement. I was talking to a guy that buys and sells businesses, and people will come to him and they've got their books. And he says, "Are your books audited?" And they say, "No." And then he says, "Come back when you've got audited books." And so then they'll come back and they'll have their books audited. And then he says, "Okay, show me your tax forms." Why is he interested in seeing the tax forms when he's got the audited books? Who are they more likely to lie to? Their accountant or the government? The accountant, right? You don't go to prison for lying to your accountant. You go to prison for lying to the government. And so then, once again, they say, and he says, "Come back when your business is clean." And how do we know that the business is clean? When his tax forms match his financial statements. Well, I would say that's more likely to be clean. Do people still lie to the government? Of course they do. So none of these things are for sure, but unaudited financial statements are at the bottom, then audited financial statements, then tax returns. The tax returns are the most reliable out of those. Okay, now let's talk about why auditing might not necessarily be the cure that people hold it out to be. Well, the year is 1998, I think, and I am working at Halliburton, and we are being audited by Arthur Anderson, the same people who brought you Enron. In fact, the exact same office that did the auditing for Enron, which is one of the biggest accounting scams in all of history. Anyway, so they are at our facility. And I see this young man walking down the aisle in the plant. And I know he doesn't belong there because he's wearing a suit. His shoes are shiny. The only thing that looks the least bit reasonable about him is the fact that he's got on his safety glasses and he's got his earplugs in. Everything else screams that this guy is an accountant. And so I'm just, curious. I'm watching, and I see one of the warehouse guys trot up to him. And he says, "Are you the accountant?" And the young man, who's about your age, says, "Why, yes, I am." And the warehouseman, who's making about $11 an hour, says, "Would you be interested to know that these people have been holding inventory on the back dock, not accepting it into the warehouse, waiting until after the first of the year?" The accountant says, "Why, yes, I would." And so the warehouseman says, "Come with me." And I follow them, and they go down. And this is back in the days when we didn't have phones with cameras. So he had one of those little disposable cameras. He goes, he's taking all sorts of pictures of all this inventory stacked up. And then I see him pulling out his cell phone, which is, of course, huge because of when it is. He's calling, and he makes a lot of calls. And then I hear him call the site manager. He says, uh, these people are holding inventory. And the guy says, what is the first thing the guy says? He's like, well, that's probably just a local mistake. He says, no, I've already talked to their facilities in Duncan, Oklahoma, Houston, Texas, New Iberia, Louisiana, Montrose, Scotland, Angola, all these places. It's the same thing all around the world. And so the site manager knows it's a problem. So what does he do? He raises it with the overall audit manager, who then raises it with the Halliburton people in the headquarters in Houston, Texas. And they say, thank you for bringing this to our attention. By the way, we were thinking about hiring a new auditor. Do you have any recommendations? Did you hear what just happened there? If you report this, you'll no longer be our auditor. Who does the hiring of the auditor? The auditee. Do you see there's some conflict of interest there? If you're Arthur Anderson, are you more interested in having a clean, a truthful audit or in getting paid? Yeah, getting paid because people are scumbags, even CPAs, right? Do you think this inventory problem showed up in the audit report? Not at all. That's why I'm telling you, audited financial statements are better than non-audited, but they're still not perfect. Firms must maintain any collateral or security in good condition. Why do I care? If I'm a bondholder, why do I want them to maintain the collateral in good condition? Yeah, if they don't pay, that's what I get to take. I want to make sure that you're changing the oil on your car if I've loaned you money for it, right? In fact, if you notice, most new cars these days come with the first 3 years of maintenance. Why do you think that is? Yeah, they're trying to protect that car because it may be collateral. By the way, how many people go in and pay cash for cars? I'm one of the few weirdos that do that. Most people finance it. And where do they finance it? Through the company. And therefore, the company stands to benefit if they make sure the oil gets changed. Does that make sense? Okay, so I want to make sure that you are taking care of that. Now let's talk about bond ratings. So they're supposedly, so your book says that it's all about default risk. I'm going to tell you it's actually a little more complex than that. It's a combination of default risk and the probability of repayment given default. So you could have someone that's a really risky borrower, but there is this lovely gold bar that you can take if they don't pay. And you can use that, you could sell a gold and you get all your money back. So the probability of default might be high, but the probability of recovery given default would be also high. And so that might actually have a decent credit rating on it simply because if they don't pay, you're still going to get your money back. You could have that same borrower have unsecured debt, and the rating on that debt would be far, far worse because the probability of recovery given default would be somewhere around 0%. And so that's why when we look at different companies, you'll see that their different bonds have different ratings. It's based on the indenture, the security, the terms, the whole thing. If you've got a bond that is more likely to pay you back, then you're going to have a higher rating for that bond. Okay, so who are the ratings companies? Well, the two big ones are S&P and Moody's, and then we've got the little also ran called Fitch. And Fitch, Fitch doesn't get a lot of respect. So the big two are S&P and Moody's. Now, if you're a big firm, all of these rating firms are going to rate each and every one of your bond issues because they want to be seen as players in the big leagues. But what if you are a smaller entity? Now you can pay to have your bonds rated. I'll give you an example. Do you guys know what City Utilities is here in Springfield? What are they? Yeah, they're who you pay your utility bills to. So they actually have a plant where they make electricity from coal. They burn a lot of coal, they make a lot of electricity. And when they were building that plant out southwest of town, they needed to borrow some money. And so my friend Janet was director of treasury at that point. And so she was talking to an investment banker. Investment bankers help people raise money. And the investment banker said, Janet, you should really consider paying to have someone to rate your bonds. And she said, why would I do that? And he said, well, certainly anyone here in Springfield knows that it's safe to lend money to city utilities, but there are a lot of investors in the rest of the country who do not know who city utilities is. And so it would make sense for you to pay someone to rate your bonds. As a result, there will be a bigger audience for your bonds. As a result, people will be willing to pay more for your bonds. And as a result, that makes your borrowing costs lower. And so Janet said, yeah, that'd be great. That's a good idea. And so then, now, that part of the story is absolutely true. The rest of this is just supposition on my part. So Janet sets up some appointments with S&P and Moody and Fitch to talk about paying them to rate the bonds. Now, they come in, and so here are my 3 rating agencies. What would you rate my bonds? So you're going to rate them,
Yeah.
but are you going to give them good or bad?
Depends on the money.
Oh, she's clever. Okay. Same answer, right? Okay, so here's the problem. We're actually negotiating on 2 things. We're actually negotiating on 2 things. We are negotiating on the rating, and I'm also wanting to do it at the lowest cost. So let's assume Samuel says, I'm going to give you good plus, and I'll do it for $5,000 plus gratuity, right? Gratuity is a little something extra under the table, right? For Samuel and his family, it's a gift. Who am I going to go with? Does that make sense? So it's the same as the problem with the auditor. Who's paying for the rating? The company. You guys may not even be old enough to remember it, but we went through this thing called the financial crisis. And a lot of it was because of these things called collateralized mortgage obligations, which were these really complex financial derivative things that no one truly understood. Yet, when they would go to S&P and Moody's and ask them to rate them, they always got it rated AAA. And then when everything went straight to hell, they had these people in front of Congress. And they said, why did you rate these bonds AAA? And they said, well, we really didn't know how to judge the risk on those bonds. By the way, if your job is to judge risk and you don't know how to judge risk, you've got one of 2 options. Number 1, turn down the job. Or number 2, rate it as total trash, right? Because if you can't understand it, undoubtedly no one else can either. But yet these people, and why were they doing that? Because these people were getting paid for those ratings. Okay, now we have 2 big groups of bonds. We're going to see that we've got ratings, all sorts of different ratings, but there's 2 big groups. There's investment grade and there's junk. So there are certain kinds of investors that cannot buy anything other than investment grade bonds. Charities, university endowments, pension funds, things like that. They're only allowed to buy investment grade bonds. Then there are these other bonds that are so risky that they fall below the threshold for being considered investment grade. Now, if they're riskier, what do they have to pay? They have to pay more or less? Yeah, they got to pay more. And so it's so funny because for the longest time, we just called these bonds junk bonds. And all junk bonds had originally been investment grade debt. And then they had fallen from grace and became what we call fallen angels. And so people would issue good debt, and then something would go wrong with the company, and then now it's junk. A guy named Michael Milken comes around in the 1980s and he says, I'll bet we could issue bonds that were original issue junk and people would still buy them. And why would they? Because they're high yield. But he goes, now who are my marketing people? If I tell you my product's name is junk, what will you say? Yeah, he thumbs down on that. So he says, tell me more about these bonds. I'm like, these things are risky AF. I don't know what that means. I just read it on Instagram. They're risky. And he's like, damn, that doesn't sound good. He's like, well, tell me some more. I'm like, they are so risky. The yield to maturity has to be incredibly high. He says, wait, I hear something I can work with. Let's stop calling these bonds junk and start to call them high yield. Right? Means exactly the same thing, but high yield just sounds so much better. Would you buy a junk bond? Most people say no. I would tell you, as long as you're holding a junk bond as part of a diversified portfolio of junk bonds, you're perfectly fine to do it. Those bonds are priced appropriately for the risk, and 95% of them will go ahead and pay as promised. So if you've got a big enough portfolio and you're making enough extra money from that high yield, you can cover that 5% principal loss. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's take a look at the pretty picture. On the left, we have Moody's. On the right, we have S&P. Now, it is widely recognized in the industry that the ratings at those two companies match up like this. If you are big A, little a at Moody's, then you are big A, big A, big A at S&P. If you are big A, little a at Moody's, you are big A at S&P. If you are A at Moody's, you're A at S&P. And if you're S&P, you've got B, B, B. What would you think? Big B, big B, big B. What would you think that the Moody's should be? You'd think it should be big B, little b, little b. But it's not. It's big B, little a, little a. Why? I don't know. But this is how it works. And so this is how all this is set up. Now, in here, we can see that the lowest level that is green is big B, little a, or big B, big B, big B. Anything in blue or green, that's the top four for the colorblind among us, those are considered investment grade. And anybody can buy those, but the bottom ones are considered junk. The bottom ones are considered junk or high yield bonds. And there is an extra rating in S&P called D. Question? Okay. They've got one more rating at S&P. It's D. D stands for default. Now, the question is this. Would you buy a defaulted bond? If you want to take over a healthy company, you buy its stock. If you want to take over a sick company, what do? You buy its bonds and you wait for it to die. This is called vulture capitalism. What I'm trying to do is get my hands on their assets. So here's the only time that vulture capitalism truly works. When you've got a company with good assets and a good business model, but it's been ran into the ground by morons. Example, Hostess. You know, the makers of Twinkies? You guys remember when Hostess went bankrupt and there was a big Twinkie scare that we were all going to be out of Twinkies? I told my wife, I said, no, those are good assets. Someone's going to swoop in and grab them. And sure enough, someone did. Now, the beautiful thing about that is not only do you manage to, you buying it for pennies on the dollar, but then as part of bankruptcy, you get to get rid of all those crazy union contracts that the idiots at Hostess got into. They had a union contract that said, well, you can't have the same people delivering bread that deliver Twinkies. And so they were sending 2 trucks every damn grocery store in the United States. It was stupid. They were doing all sorts of stupid stuff. That was a good business model, good assets. Now, what about the magazine Sky Mall? You guys remember Sky Mall? This is a catalog that was in the back of the airplane seat. And basically, it was so funny. I saw their CEO on television, and he was talking about how crappy the business model was in the age of internet commerce. And then he caught himself. He said, but we still think we have the ability to sell it as a going concern. You could just tell that he got caught in his own truth, right? What's worse than getting caught in a lie? He was caught telling the truth. By the way, don't lie. Not good. Okay, so that's vulture capitalism. If you see the vultures circling you and you don't feel all that bad, who's right? The vultures. This is your first time. It's not their first rodeo. Okay, we will start here next time.